It's time to talk about inculturation. What is the origin of this term? What does the Church mean by it? And what are correct and incorrect ways of understanding inculturation? The Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 854, says, "Inculturation is the way the gospel takes flesh in each people's particular culture." Now, this phrase inculturation was introduced at the time of the Second Vatican Council really as a politically correct term to describe what used to be known as Christianization, but with a subtle difference of tone. While Christianization seemed to emphasize the institutional, deliberate campaigns of the Church to establish Christian culture in mission areas, inculturation, on the other hand, emphasized the organic, undirected manner in which the Christian faith slowly transforms a culture, more of a gradual evolution from below rather than a deliberate imposition from above. Now, I know Catholics, especially traditional Catholics, have mixed feelings or ambivalence about the term. I personally think the distinction I just explained is a false dichotomy, and hence a new term was unnecessary, like the much touted and fake distinction between evangelization and proselytism. It depends upon a meaningless distinction between trying to make converts intentionally to the faith and intentionally living the faith and making converts incidentally. So the distinction between Christianization and inculturation tries to make us believe that boldly proclaiming the gospel is somehow different or opposed to being transformed by the gospel.
But wait, there is a real logical distinction between institutional proselytism and personal evangelization based on witness.
Look, I know that the terms are logically distinct and that they can mean different things, but what I'm saying is, on the ground, you see that the Christianization of a culture requires both of these elements. It requires, yes, of course, a personal witness of the individuals involved in face-to-face sincere evangelization, but it also requires the institutional, organized support of the church. It requires the bottom-up approach and the top-down approach. So for Christianization, inculturation, whatever you want to call it, for the conversion of peoples to be successful, it requires both elements. They always occur together, which is why it is meaningless to make these distinctions between inculturation and Christianization, or to suggest that proselytism and evangelization are opposed to one another. For in reality, these are all part of the same big picture. The gospel cannot organically transform culture if it's not first intentionally introduced into culture. Just like Catholics don't tend to draw others to conversion by their good example unless converting others is something they happen to care about and work towards. So I do not think we needed this word inculturation. What the church means by inculturation is simply just a stage of Christianization. But the church has chosen to adopt this word, so let's run with it on the understanding that authentic inculturation means the way the gospel takes up elements of a non-Christian culture, transforms them, and reorients them towards Christ. And we should also bear in mind, in speaking of inculturation, both the Catechism and Pope John Paul II teach that inculturation sometimes requires, quote, a breaking with ancestral customs incompatible with the Catholic faith. That's the Catechism of the Catholic Church, paragraph 1206, citing Pope John Paul II. Not everything is capable of being Christianized, and not every cultural element is good just because it is indigenous. So whether we're talking about inculturation or using the more traditional phrase Christianization, traditionally what happens when a culture embraces the faith is that the gospel is the active agent. It is Christianity which transforms, and the culture which is molded by Christianity. Culture is passive. Christianity is the constant. Of course, how the faith is presented may need to be adapted to local custom to make the immutable truths of the faith comprehensible. Hence, Saints Cyril and Methodius created Old Slavonic for the use of the Slavs, and the Jesuits of New France put the Roman liturgy into Huron, as well as adopting some of the living habits of the Huron. In all these cases, something was adapted to the local culture for the purpose of making the understanding of the faith easier and its transmission more certain. However, over the years, it's become apparent that this is not what certain theologians and members of the hierarchy mean when they discuss inculturation. In light of decades of interfaith events, be they the Papua New Guinea masses of John Paul II, the Assisi gatherings, and the confusion over the Pachamama image at the Amazon Synod, as well as the language we've seen coming from some of these theologians over the years on subjects like indigenous peoples, Amazonia, etc., it's clear that they have a very different take on enculturation. In fact, the whole idea of Christianity transforming culture has become passé. In fact, it's seen as a kind of colonialism. A good summary of this view can be found in the 1971 Barbados Declaration from the World Council of Churches. Though the Catholic Church was not a signatory to the document, its propositions were far-reaching and have influenced Catholic theologians and missionaries. In the Barbados Declaration, we will find a repudiation of traditional missionary activities as forms of cultural colonialism and an emphasis on natives encountering Christ through their own existing religious traditions. Thus, the role of the missionary now is to learn from the native cultures, immerse themselves in native custom and lore in order to show the natives how God is already with them. In effect, native cultures become Emmanuel. This is why contemporary discussion on the missions focuses so much on that obnoxious word proclamation, a proclamation that God can already be found by a deeper appreciation of their own religious tradition. One is reminded of Mother Teresa's dictum that her work was to, quote, make Hindus better Hindus and Muslims better Muslims. It's proclamation without conversion, evangelization without metanoia.
Well, just who do you think you are? How dare you criticize Catholic mission work? Have you gone overseas? Have you worked with the indigenous poor? Have you labored in the mission fields? You haven't, so you better just shut your mouth because you don't have any idea what...
No, I've never done missionary work. But look, I'm not a missionary and I'm not a farmer. But if I'm standing around watching farmers work the field year after year and they produce no fruit, it doesn't take another farmer to recognize that they are doing something wrong. And any objective observer of the Catholic missionary efforts around the world over the past 40 years would have to be blind to not notice that something is drastically amiss. If you want to get an idea of what's actually going on out there in the missions, I suggest you read my article, Interreligious Dialogue, a case study of the Colombian missions. It's an older article, back from when I had a penchant for using red font for emphasis, mea culpa, but it gives a thorough, gut-wrenching synopsis of how many modern Catholic missionaries view their apostolate. In light of these developments, Inculturation takes on a new meaning, one inverse to the traditional idea of Christianization. Instead of the faith acting upon indigenous culture, it is now indigenous culture which acts upon the faith. The church has gone from being the active agent to the passive object of change. It is now the church's disciplines, liturgy, spirituality, and administration which must be adapted in light of her encounter with non-Christian religions. The church is no longer universal teacher. She is universal listener. This language of listening and learning is endemic in the documents of the Amazon Synod. Anyone remember listening as one of the offices of the church? Yeah, me neither. And before anyone says, what we're seeing today is no different than cultural adaptations the church has accepted in the past, it should be noted that it is essentially different. St. Jean de Brebeuf created a liturgy in the Huron language, but at the end of the day, St. Jean believed the spirits of the Hurons were demons, that the Huron were in dire need of the salvation of Christ, that without baptism they would be eternally lost. And consequently, he sought to actually make converts among them. These assumptions and even the end goal of baptizing and making converts are completely missing in the contemporary vision of the church's missionary work. Now, when one no longer cares about making converts, when pagans are told that God is already with them and can be found through their own religious traditions, when the role of the church is no longer to teach but to listen, when the very concept of trying to deliberately make Christians out of native peoples is rejected as colonialism, then we are no longer talking about the same thing, even if appearances may suggest superficial similarities. Saying that what's going on today in the missions is not essentially different than the church's process of Christianization in the past is absurd. It's as absurd as saying that the road to Chicago will take you to the same place as the road to Atlanta just because you can see Speedway gas stations along both routes. Look, this was never about the value of limited use of indigenous languages or about non-Western depictions of Christ, Mary, and the saints. Context matters. The end goal matters. This is Catholic. This is not. Cultural symbols do not mean different things just because we say they do. They have an objective meaning. This is not Christ. No matter how many similarities we notice between Christ and Odin, no matter how much depicting Christ this way might have made things easier for the pagan Norse, no matter how many people might sing hymns to this and invoke it as Christ, no matter how many Vatican bureaucrats and pop apologists might say that this is Christ, or at least maybe the personification of the land of Scandinavia. And to say otherwise is syncretism. This is not Mary. This is Mary. And it's irrelevant that breasts, nursing, and maternity appear in both images. Again, context matters. The end goal matters. And when current ecclesiastical policy vis-a-vis the missions is at such variance with the way the church has always understood its mission to the nations, then yes, this is radically different than how cultures were assimilated into the church in ages past. Most fundamentally because the church is no longer assimilating, but being assimilated. And if you can't see that, then your case of rectal cranial inversion is of astonishing severity. But nothing to see here, right? Everything is fine. We're fine. Just more trad griping about nothing. Nothing has changed. It's always been this way. We've always been at war with East Asia. Anyone can be forgiven for being too simple to understand a complex problem, but it takes a special kind of dumb to take a simple problem and pretend it's complex. Want to know why Catholicism is hemorrhaging in Amazonia? It's because we're not trying. It's that simple. Don't believe me? Why do you think Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons consistently grow their congregations worldwide? It's because they actually try to make converts, and they're not apologetic about it. Good Lord, if the Church of Christ actually tried with our sacraments, our rich heritage, beautiful teachings, the only thing stopping the restoration of Christendom is our own bad ideas. Now listen, the idea of inculturation Catholics are being asked to swallow today is a diabolical inversion of Christ's missionary mandate. And ultimately, the Church can't inculturate if we have no consensus of what a Catholic culture is supposed to look like. Until we recover a sense of Catholic identity, the embarrassing spectacle that is the Catholic missions will continue.